And when the stories came out, there was often a huge reaction. The CEO was sentenced to 10 years in jail. I have criteria for what I call a high-stakes decision, and it's very simple. Some of the greatest decisions in life lack some logic. Quitting your job to sail around the world. This was a big eye-opener for me. You know, when I was younger, different people really see the world differently. This is something that I think really dawns on us over time. There's a couple pretty common problems that I tend to run into with people. One is incorrect problem framing. I have this term I call the cheetah pause. I remind myself of this cheetah pause before I go in to talk with somebody else. As artificial intelligence rolls out, and as we're all starting to use this tool, you've got to remember that you're the chief decider in your own life.
Welcome back, everyone, to a new episode of Business Unbound. Every week, I sit down with exceptional practitioners who share how they actually think about the most consequential matters in their domain. We explore the mental models, the frameworks, and the instincts they have developed over the course of their careers. And you get what took them decades to build in one conversation. And you leave with sharper thinking for the decisions that you face. I'm your host, Florian. Today, I'm joined by Cheryl Strauss Einhorn. Cheryl is the founder of a decision sciences company and a longtime professor and educator who teaches decision-making at Columbia Business School and Cornell University's Johnson Graduate School of Management. In today's conversation, Cheryl and I will explore why experienced people still make poor decisions even when they think they are being rigorous, how hidden data preferences distort judgment without us noticing, and why some of the worst mistakes are not bad decisions, but well-executed solutions to the wrong problem. Cheryl, welcome to Business Unbound.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Cheryl, to get us started, perhaps, for people who may be meeting you for the first time today, can you explain to us what are you spending most of your time on at the moment, and what kinds of decisions or problems are people usually bringing to
So
you?
I'm spending most of my time these days teaching, writing, and coaching, primarily with my new book that is getting ready to come out about artificial intelligence and decision making, called The Human Edge: Smarter Decisions in the Age of AI, and really thinking about how to help people to use AI in the problems that they're solving. And for the types of problems that people come with, they come with personal problems and professional problems, and I'll give you a couple examples. Sometimes an individual will come with a major medical decision. For instance, somebody came recently about a reconstructive surgery, whether or not to have it after something had happened to them. One organization was thinking about switching their teams from being set up by geography to being set up by specialty. And so really rethinking the organization. One company in the long haul trucking business was thinking about how to solve the problem of drivers getting pulled over and having difficulty navigating the language conversations, veterans returning from active duty, a senior leader wanting to create a new innovation position, somebody actually thinking about whether or not to start a school for swimming. So they really run the gamut all over, and I enjoy it all.
And ideally, for our conversation today, we may want to focus on the business lens in particular, as most of our audience members are from the broader business domain. What I found very interesting when I looked at your background is that you have teaching experience at Columbia Business School, you have investigative journalism experience, you run decision-making in practice. And when I think about all of this, and when you actually put this together, what did your background train you to notice about how, let's say, smart, experienced people make decisions that they often do not see themselves?
Such a thoughtful question. I think there's a couple things. One is people feel very proud of big decisions that they've made well. It's a personal accomplishment to have been able to really navigate the complexity. The second thing that I feel like it's really trained me to see is that somebody's risk preference is actually far more dominant than you may think. So somebody who's very thoughtful in the way that they approach their decision making, somebody that puts a lot of consideration in how to mitigate the downside, they also tend to struggle with smaller, even reversible decisions. And I find that very interesting. There must be something very sticky about that. And the flip side seems to hold true as well, that people who are constantly taking risks at work and in life do that even when the consequences are very big. So risk tolerance is actually something that seems sort of very built in for people. I also feel like it's really trained me to notice that people conflate research with analysis, but that collecting information is actually very different than making meaning from it. I'll just say one more thing that it's really trained me to notice is people spend a lot more time in problem solving than they need to, even after they've made a decision. There is one category of problem solver that I've noticed long after a decision is made. In their mind, the decision isn't actually fully over. They will continue to ruminate on the problem solving and perhaps even second guess themselves, even while they're in that execution phase.
And when you talk about different categories of decision makers, what categories do you see? How do you
So,
differentiate?
my third book called Problem Solver is all about this topic of what I call problem solver profiles. Sometimes you have to write a book to really learn from it. And Problem Solver is the result of what I learned after putting both Problem Solved, my book on personal and professional decision making, and investing in financial research about financial and investment decisions out in the world. What I realized is that there are five dominant ways that people approach decision making. They each have beautiful strengths, but they each come with some real limitations. And that's because the underlying value structure is different, right? So if there are sort of six or so main variables within problem solving, how you think about speed, how you think about when and who to include, how important are stakeholders, when you think about your ability to identify the next step in a decision, your confidence that that decision will work out for you, and the type of data that you rely on, these things sort of consolidate into what I call five problem solver profiles. I gave them each fun names. I call them the adventurer, the detective, the listener, the thinker, and the visionary. And if you'd like, I can briefly outline what each is. So
I think this would be helpful. Yeah, maybe we can talk about those five archetypes that you have developed, and perhaps in a business context that people can ideally conceptualize in which category they more.
absolutely. And I want to offer to your listeners, I've developed an assessment that is a very brief quiz, the problem solver profile quiz. And if you go to area method, AREA method.com, it's free. You can take the quiz, and in about 5 to 7 minutes, you will have self categorized into one of these five profiles. And then the app will tell you a little bit about the meaning of that. And then, of course, Problem Solver, the book, goes into it more. So the adventurer is our most intuitive decision maker. This is somebody who has a very strong gut instinct. Their decisions come from a visceral, internally driven sense of forward momentum. And while that is beautiful, there are a couple of cognitive biases associated with that. One, there's an underlying optimism bias. They tend to think that they can take a decision because if it starts to go awry, the next decision is always ahead. And so there's a beautiful way to move forward in the world with that. There's also, though, a bit of a planning fallacy to that. Because they're very quick to take a decision, they feel like it's internally motivated, they can underestimate the amount of planning that they've actually put into securing something that is going to work out well the first time.
We can stick with the adventurer for the time being for now. When you said they can be very quick in making decisions, it feels to me that especially in a business context, that this happens quite a bit where every day you are exposed to so many different impulses and situations, and it's a consistent mix between acting and reacting, and you're forced to make decisions all the time. Do you have concrete examples based on the work that you did where the adventurer type was particularly
I
successful?
think the adventurer is very successful in the sense that their ease of taking a decision allows them to quickly get into action which allows them to test out and begin to collect new information, right? Because they've been able to take that next logical step. It's an incremental step a lot of the time. It doesn't have to be something that is very long dated. And as a result of that, if it doesn't go right, they can also move quickly to pivot. They are not somebody who's anchored. They don't get stuck in one solution. So if you're in a meeting with an adventurer and you come, Florian, with a good idea, they can immediately jump and say, actually, I like Florian's idea better. And they're actually able to articulate why it is that they think that that is a better solution to take. And so in a team environment, that's a very valuable person to have in your cohort. And I think it's underappreciated in businesses because the downside of that is that somebody may see that ease of ability to identify a next step as hasty. But I think in a team environment, when you recognize what it adds to the value, it becomes very powerful to be able to actually better include and entertain different ideas that are brought to the table.
And what does the adventurer need to be aware of when there's light? There may also be shadow.
Yeah. So some of the cognitive biases that I was talking about really can be limitations for an adventurer. So for example, they can move without having a lot of data. The other thing is because they are driven by an internal sense of direction, internally, that's got to be based on the past, right? So to some extent, they're framing the current moment out of something that they have experienced before. You can think of it almost as like a bit of the curse of wisdom, right? Wisdom really is important. We value it, but sometimes it can narrow the way that we think about something because we think we have a good idea that should actually move us forward. And they may not take the time to basically say, you know what, can I grab a piece of disconfirming data? Is there something that can break this thesis? And if they can't break the thesis when they've slowed down, that's terrific. They can feel even more confident. But if they can, it's given them that brief moment to make sure that they actually stop and consider something else.
What's the next
Yeah, so the
archetype?
next one's the detective. I'm the detective. We are people who really like hard evidence and facts, and we like research. So we like to make evidence-based decisions. That's all well and good. But some of the cognitive biases associated with that are confirmation bias, because I'm good at research. I can look for data that confirms a favorite hypothesis. And you can have a lot of pieces of information that confirm a hypothesis, but if you have one insurmountable hurdle, that decision is not going to work out for you. The other thing about the detective that is a limitation is a bit of a projection bias. Because I care about data so much, I assume you do too. So when we're in the conversation, we may not actually be thinking about it the same way, and I don't necessarily know it. And that brings me to our third problem solver profile, which is our most collaborative, cooperative, trusting profile. And that's what I call the listener. These are people who really value and are able to effectively collect the wisdom of others. But a downside and limitation of that would be a liking bias, overvaluing information from a trusted advisor or somebody you have an affinity for, and also a social proof bias, right? They can overweight the wisdom of the crowds and they have a tougher time accessing that inner voice that is so strong for the adventurer. The fourth, go ahead, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, perhaps if I may. A question that naturally comes to my mind when you explain this concept of the third archetype. I think it resonates, and we see this in business also all the time. Do you have a concrete example where you had a client or where you were working with someone who was most likely this particular archetype, how they made a poor decision possibly, and what they could have done to be more aware of how they behave and how they could have made a better decision
Yeah,
perhaps?
I see a lot of times with a listener that they know their own mind, but because they value what other people say so much, they may not express it clearly, or they may miss out on the opportunity because the time has passed. So I've been working with this one particular coaching client for the last couple of years who works in finance and is, I would call him, a mid-level division head. And he has a beautiful listener profile. He really values and asks other people what they care about. And it's very hard for him, even though he has his own thoughts, to figure out sometimes how to access that, how to articulate it clearly, and where it should go in the conversation. And I think at times this has led him to miss out on sort of showcasing his own expertise and in redirecting the conversations at work to something that better represents what his team needs or what his team is seeing in the market and the way that they want to invest for the type of stocks that they're particularly focused on.
So we have the adventurer, we have the detective, we have the listener. What's the next
So the
one?
next one is our most cautious, but probably our most thoughtful decision-making archetype, and I call this the thinker. This is the person who likes to collect a lot of different types of information. So they like the evidence-based information the detective likes, but they very much value the wisdom of other people, like the listener. And then they have an added maybe limitation on who they listen to the most, and those are authority figures. So if you're a real expert or if you're higher up in the hierarchy, they tend to give even more weight than maybe people at their own level or people who are in subordinate positions. And because they like to collect a lot of different types of information, it's a slow going process. They also at times have a real loss aversion. Because they care so much about the process, they would rather limit the downside more than either solving for the best outcome possible or the best possible outcome. And this means they can end up in a real analysis paralysis. But when this kind of a thinker has actually arrived at a decision, one of the things that is truly unique and valuable about them is they can explain to you why. They know the process they went through, they know how they weighed the evidence, and they know how the path that they actually chose became the one that they thought was going to have the greatest success. So a very valuable member on any team, but slow going. And then the final problem solver profile is called the visionary. This is somebody who really cares about something that is original and creative. You may be sitting in a conversation with them and they may be seeing a North Star that the rest of the team just hasn't seen. And so they can have a real scarcity bias where they overweight something that is unusual when something workaday would be just as good because they care so much about the originality. And at the same time, they bring the fresh and the new ideas. So they really open up the conversation in a totally different way than the adventurer who can come to the next step because the visionary can see really far into the future, the mission, the vision, and what could be possible.
So adventurer, detective, listener, thinker, and I forgot the last name. Sorry.
Visionary and visionary. So they're each driven by something that is different, right? And they each ascribe to a different kind of data that becomes most important when solving problems for them. And they each bring totally different value to being able to better understand the decisions that you're facing.
You know, it strikes me that those archetypes, they don't seem to be mutually exclusive. When you were explaining them, I thought first, oh yeah, I'm an adventurer. Then you continue to explain, and then I thought, yeah, maybe I'm also a detective, and also the third one, or also the fourth one. How do you think about the archetypes on a
Yeah,
spectrum?
it's a great point. So these are not proscriptive. They're not going to tell you what you're going to do after you've listened to this podcast. What they are going to tell you is that these are well-worn habits and pathways that when you are in your everyday mode and you're not really thinking about your decisions, this is your default. And you will notice them now that we've been talking about them. You will also notice that with intentionality, you can become a more dynamic decision maker by learning from the other profiles and simply by trying them on. So you could decide to go to this, if you're an adventurer, go to the supermarket like a detective, or you could decide to plan a vacation like a listener. You can try on big or small decisions and see where resistance and discomfort comes up. That is a great notice that that's an area of growth for you as a decision maker. We each have some of all five. Some people, though, that dominant is so strong that the other five really don't show up that much. And for other people, you may have a pretty strong secondary that can break through at times and overtake that dominant profile.
Let's see if we can make this very practical. And if you are an ambitious professional with a certain exposure in business, it appears to me that all five qualities in decision making are relevant.
Yes.
When do you decide in which situation which hat is most
So I
adequate?
think that's a great question. There is no one right profile at a specific time, just like there's no one perfect team construction. What I would say is that having a lot of one profile in an organization or on a team does tend to emphasize the limitations instead of the strengths. So a leader of an organization, you do want to surround yourself with people who think differently than you do so that you really can get that fulsome understanding of the problems that you're solving. That being said, some types of attributes of the different profiles work very well in certain situations. When you're doing something that's entirely new, to come in with that listener focus, very valuable. Right? You've never been there before. What do the other people have to say? What is the context that you're walking into? Instead of coming in like an adventurer and thinking that it's something that is internally generated is going to be able to necessarily help you fully experience something that is new. And for a detective who can totally overvalue the data, I have to constantly remind myself when I am in a situation that I want to lead by making sure that I value the people instead of the data. I want to listen to what others have to say. I might not be correct in the way that I am framing a situation. And I won't know that if I'm not there prepared to sort of pry open that cognitive space for new information and insight.
I feel it could be helpful if we briefly differentiate between, let's say, decision making on the one hand and exercising judgment on the other hand. How do you think about these two terminologies?
Judgment versus decision making. So, decision making is the process of preparing to take a choice,
Mhm.
and judgment is the calibration that you use in order to make the priorities that define that choice. So if I'm thinking about what team construction is going to be right for this new project, right? The variables within that of the attributes and skill sets and personalities that could potentially come together, those are a lot of different variables. My judgment is going to tell me what are the things that are most important. What are the things that really are going to make the meaning that underlie how I am going to make the decision.
And one of the aspects I find probably most interesting in this context is that based on my observations, many experienced professionals, they may feel like they are being rigorous because they are superficially busy, they are reading, they are asking questions, they're gathering information, they are in meetings all the time, and there's input, input, input everywhere the whole day nonstop. And yet they still end up with making poor decisions, which becomes clear only in hindsight. And I'm wondering, based on your experience, where does this start to happen, and how do people start mistaking this effort for real decision making
Yeah, so
clarity?
there's a couple pretty common problems that I tend to run into with people. One is incorrect problem framing, right? The starting point is unclear, so you can't get to a good solution, right? They start in the problem, having not stopped to think about the proper frame. Another one is what I mentioned before, conflating research and analysis, assuming that gathering information is making meaning from it. That's a separate process. Another one is not knowing when to stop. Get me more information. Well, information is no longer power. Right now, we can all get information with our AI tools, but that doesn't make us smarter unless we actually are able to both guide that research and know what kind of meaning we want to extract from it. And just one more is sometimes I see short-termism. People solve the problem for now. They don't solve the problem holistically, which means that they have to revisit it at some other time.
And let's maybe try to make this concrete. If you were advising an individual with an executive capacity in senior management, maybe a CEO, founder, entrepreneur, and they were to decide, let's say, whether or not they should enter into a new market, which is a decision that comes up all the time. How would the ideal blueprint look like? How you start making this decision, how you think about the decision-making process to get to an answer in the end?
Yeah, so within complex problem solving, there's sort of 8 links in a chain, right? And each link is important. If you skip over one of these steps, you actually can weaken the whole chain. So if you're thinking about starting a new business, a new market that you're going to go into, the first thing that you want to do is frame the problem and identify your success metrics, right? What am I actually solving and what has to happen in the outcome for me to know that I've made a good decision? Now you have a clear North Star and you have the 1, 2, or 3 variables that are most important to you. And then the next thing that I would do is I would start with the primary source information from up close on the subject of the decision. So if you think about the system for decision making that I developed that I call the area method, each of the letters of area stands for a unique step of the process to make sure that you are looking at a decision from a variety of perspectives, and you are also checking and challenging the cognitive biases, the mental mistakes, assumptions, and judgments that we all have so that you can arrive at an evidence-based decision. So the first A in area is absolute, and you would be thinking about, all right, if I'm thinking about expanding into a specific market, what can I learn about that market and how the product that I'm thinking about launching in that area or the service, how is it actually working in that particular area? And so that way you're really building a foundation. Are in area relative then begins to put that foundational piece of information into the broader context. What does this actually look like overall? So if I am already in this particular product area, how much of what I'm doing now would also fit into what I've learned about how this product or service actually exists in that new market? What can I learn from experts, from a literature review? What can I learn about best practices? How many of my competitors are already there? And so on. And then in the next part of area, the letter E, that I call the twin engines of creativity. It's exploration and exploitation. So now exploration is getting beyond document-based information to actually identify good prospects and ask them great questions. It's interviewing. Here's where you figure out the difference between the map and the terrain. You've learned from documents what that new market looks like for this product or service. You've put it also in the bigger context. How much would this really expand on what I'm already doing and what I've learned from experts? But now you would talk to people maybe who are in that market or people who actually sell a similar product or the customers that you would be going after. So you can actually differentiate what happens in the real world so that you can learn from them. And then in exploitation, that's this new step of decision making that I've added where you have a couple creative exercises to actually interpret the data that you've collected. And this is really an opportunity to look at the diagnosticity of the individual pieces of data. Just to give you an example, a fever tells you something is wrong, but would probably tell you nothing about what is wrong. So as you collect your evidence, really understanding which pieces of evidence to help ground the decision in that really matter to your decision is very valuable. And then in the final step analysis, you actually cobble the pieces back together and it helps you come to conviction in the decision. So that by the time that you've gotten through the exploitation phase, you have a pretty good idea of which pathway you're going to take, how you have collected evidence from a variety of perspectives, how you've actually undergone the data analysis, and you're ready now to make a confident decision that you've got conviction in.
And I understand that the area method is partly a culmination of your work and your experience over many, many, many years. Can you perhaps explain a little bit what the key observations were that ultimately ended up to becoming the area
Yeah,
method?
I would say that the key observations come from my background in investigative journalism. I spent over a decade at the business magazine Barron's. And while I was there, I ended up specializing in what you would call the bearish company stories, taking a skeptical look at a company's finances or at their strategy. And when the stories came out, there was often a huge reaction. A lot of times, because I was writing about publicly traded companies, the stock exchange would halt the shares because there wasn't an orderly order flow. Sometimes regulators would get involved. About half a dozen companies went out of business. And for one company, the CEO was sentenced to 10 years in jail. And it really got me thinking about, how do I know that I'm telling stories that are true, that should be told, that I'm marshaling the right evidence, and that I'm checking and challenging my own assumptions and judgments and the assumptions and judgments of the sources who were willing to talk to me about the stories that I was writing about. And so it was really this effort to do a more ethical job at work. And as I started to look for frameworks that I could apply to my investigative journalism work, I realized that there was nothing out there to check and challenge these cognitive biases. And so, given my background in research, I thought maybe I can strategically interrupt my thinking and the way that we naturally combine different thinking processes into individual steps to hold me accountable to actually better understand each of the perspectives that we need when we're solving complex problems.
And talking about complex problems is, from what I understand, the magic phrase here. The area method sounds a little bit too complex to solve every
Yes.
problem with this approach. Is that
Yeah, I
true?
would say first, I use it now as an operating system. Like in my mind, I try to run through the different perspectives of, the primary source information in absolute, then putting it in context, thinking about knowledgeable people who I could talk to, challenging myself, etc. But I have criteria for what I call a high stakes decision. And it's very simple. Outcome is unknown. Decision is going to have a long term impact. Price for getting it wrong is costly. When those three things exist, that for me is the litmus test for when I want to apply a system for decision making, like the area method. That's when I actually want to make sure that I'm going through the process. And sometimes what you can do is you can say, actually, when I think about area, actually, I feel like I've been thinking about this decision for a while. I'm really pretty knowledgeable about whatever it is I'm solving. Maybe I've done some of the absolute and relative work. And maybe I notice, okay, I actually haven't gone and talked to people. I haven't actually done that exploration step. I'm going to go and just zoom right into that part of the process. Or I have all this research, but I haven't actually sat down to check and challenge the biases and look at how many ways the data can be interpreted. I'm going to zoom into the exploitation phase. And so there are also ways where you can speed it up, where you don't have to stop to go through all the pieces. But every time I do zoom into a piece or slow down, almost always the decision changes before my eyes as I move from one perspective to the next in terms of my own understanding of the problem I'm solving.
We talked about the area method based on a hypothetical example, a new market entry. To the extent that you can share, could you run us through an actual business situation that you were aware of where the area method was
Yeah,
applied?
I was working with the CEO of an international ecotourism company a little while ago, and her organization was really quickly growing. They were thinking about expanding into another new market, and she had 10 direct reports. And she just felt like she was always in these operational meetings and she didn't have enough for the long-term strategy and she didn't want to miss the opportunity. So she came to me and she thought she needed a chief of staff. So when we started this process, she thought this could really solve her problem, help her with communicating to all of the people who were really important division heads and free up her time for that strategy. So in the first A of absolute for area, we looked up close. What is a chief of staff? What are the actual responsibilities? What does the role look like? Where does the role exist? And right away, we were able to collect information that this is a very senior level person with cross-functional decision-making power. And I think she was a little surprised by that because she hadn't really realized that it was another senior person who could come to the table. Well, in relative work where she began to see, well, what does this look like in different organizations? What are best practices? It actually further expanded her understanding that this is somebody who really has, in a lot of ways, their own domain to make senior level decisions, and that the role could be defined totally differently in different places. And this made her realize that she hadn't thought very much about, well, what exactly would this person be doing besides taking some of these 10 division heads and having them report to her and also work as a funnel for communication. In exploration, she went and talked to human resources professionals, people who had chief of staff roles, companies where the role looked different from one another. And she recognized she didn't really know what else this person would do. She also began to get pretty uncomfortable with the idea of offloading some very senior level cross-functional decisions. And she worried about how well the communication would work between her and this person, as well as the fact that it could make her siloed from these key recruits if she didn't have something that was clearly defined, and if she didn't pick the right person who didn't mesh well with her. So in exploitation, as we began to really look at the data, she recognized she was looking for an external solution to an internal problem. She didn't actually want a chief of staff. She wanted to be able to reorganize her schedule, to be able to have fewer of these direct reports, but also be able to keep her finger on the pulse, to be the one to help have an input with these division level decisions and also be able to have that information flow inform her ability to decide on the next new market. So it was an entire change in her understanding of the problem that she was solving, whose responsibility it was to solve it, and how it was going to be resolved well. And so in the final analysis step, she actually came up with a new plan for her schedule, checked in with her direct reports about how this would work for them, what problems they saw so they could refine it, and then rolled out this new system for herself.
What happened next?
So what happened next was that it was hard to stick to the schedule, right? She found herself easily slipping into not being able to delegate as much as she wanted to, and having to recognize that she actually needed to take that step in order to be able to achieve the vision that she wanted for the organization. She had to simply put her trust that some of these division heads who had been there as long as she had could make decisions, could inform her, and it would be okay that it wasn't exactly how she might do it, as it also got the decision made and allowed her to focus looking forward on some of these bigger strategic initiatives. So she worked with that discomfort, recognizing that it actually was the growth she needed.
And the area method is obviously a framework, and frameworks help us to think. Frameworks sometimes deviate from reality. And would you be aware of any situations where you would say, okay, maybe the area method isn't well suited for this particular situation, or if this happens, maybe you should deviate?
Yeah, I've got two examples of that. The area method is meant to pry open this cognitive space for new information and insight. So if you don't come in open-minded, it's not going to work as well for you. You may move through the perspectives without the self reflection that it is meant to achieve. So you going into the process, I think, is very humbling. I was mentioning that there's almost no time that somebody goes in and comes out in the exact same place. Think about all the different perspectives that you're inhabiting and the information that you're collecting. You would hope that your mind would be expanded, changed, refined in some meaningful way. So coming in open-minded is really important. And then there's a whole category of decisions that don't make any sense, that we shouldn't use the area method for. Some of the greatest decisions in life lack some logic. Becoming a parent, getting married, quitting your job to sail around the world. There's a lot of these passion projects that we would never do if we were trying to make a purely logical decision. And the world is better off for it. Think about the things that people dream up or the things that people actually make possible. And so I think those are two different ways where I would say maybe you don't want to use a system like AIR.
I think this is the inherent tension between making rational decisions or trying to make rational decisions on the one hand and making decisions which are much more personal in nature. When we were liaising before our conversation, there was one aspect that you mentioned to me that I find interesting, which is that you used to believe people were rational, and over time you came to see that we all look through what you called a dirty windshield of past experience, assumptions, and judgments. Can you explain your thinking
Yeah,
here?
this was a big eye opener for me. When I was younger, I didn't realize that different people really see the world differently. This is something that I think really dawns on us over time. And yet, nobody prepares us for the moment when we realize that we've just walked out of a movie with somebody else. Or we just finished a conversation with somebody else and they've had an entirely different perspective on what actually happened than we do. And so what I began to realize is that our experience in life create a filter and we see everything through that dirty windshield, which means we're not actually in the present moment fully. We're seeing through the lens of our past. So we need a way to really break free with intentionality. And that was really this whole idea behind Area, is that I want to see the big world. I want to be more present for other people. And I want to be able to listen to you, not so that I'm preparing to react, not so that I'm listening to confirm what I'm thinking, but to truly be able to have the curiosity to gather what it is that you're experiencing and you're thinking.
And you mentioned it before. I mean, you need the ability to create more cognitive space.
Yes.
How do you actually do this? Like very, very practically, how can someone create this cognitive space to see past someone's own windshield and to become more confident inside that?
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Yeah, so I have this term I call the cheetah paws. So the cheetah is the fastest land animal, but its hunting prowess is that it decelerates up to 9 miles an hour in a single stride. And what that does is it builds in maneuverability, agility, and flexibility. And that's what we all need in quality decision making. So there's a couple ways, but they both ask for intentionality. So I remind myself of this cheetah pause before I go in to talk with somebody else, that I want to be there fully for the conversation. What's the conversation that I'm coming into? And how do I want to prepare myself to listen? And then the second thing that I think is useful is to also foreground, what am I thinking? What are my expectations about this? And by bringing my expectations, what's invisible, to be visible to me, I have a better way to just notice, gee, I'm already thinking about this issue this way. And now that I recognize that, I can set that aside. And now with that handy, visible reminder of the cheetah pause, I can come into the meeting much more prepared. There is a fine line here. I don't want to be so prepared that I'm not present, but I need to be prepared enough that I can also sort of take off my ego, my own thinking, my perspective, so that I can be listening to you.
And I feel like that we have covered quite a lot of ground already. And if you had to distill the key aspects that are at the, let's say, heart of our conversation into one or two or three things that you would want people to understand, that you would want people to make inherent to make better
I would
decisions?
say our decisions are the way we get to the future. And each of us has our special sauce, our own little recipe for how we do that. And although we've done it all our lives and we're the expert in our own lives, many of us haven't actually thought about what's that recipe. And so, to the extent that you can think about your decision making and you can think about what you've done well, what's satisfying, and what are some mistakes you just don't want to make again, you can continue to make decisions that are going to allow you to be more courageous in your future. And the second way to be more courageous is not only to get to know your own internal process a little bit better, but is also to recognize that at some point, most decisions are reversible, which means you can take a decision, and even though there's going to be a consequence, most likely you can still pivot to do something else. And so I hope what this conversation unlocks for people is a real sense of agency and possibility that you can better create the future that is ahead of you.
And for someone listening who is an ambitious professional, who's in business, and who suspects that they may be potentially gathering information too quickly without really analyzing it, or trusting the wrong kinds of data, or rushing too quickly into problem-solving mode, as you mentioned, what are the first, let's say, 2 or 3 questions that they should ask themselves?
What is the kind of information that you're relying on? And are there types of information that you also want to include in this decision? That would be one, because we tend to consistently rely on the type of information we're most comfortable with and ascribe the greatest value to. So that's one. And then the second thing that I would say is, are you always going to the same group of stakeholders? Are there other stakeholders who you should be including? There's been this, what I call one of the decision myths around the fact that it's our decision alone. And I think that's a great disservice to us as decision makers. At some point, for that decision to work out well, other people have to buy in and they matter. And so the only way to truly holistically solve our problems is to make sure that you've made space for the right stakeholder inclusion.
How do you know when you're not doing it correctly?
When you're always going to the same voices, when you have a key constituency that's not at the table, when you haven't found somebody who either knows you as a decision maker, your strengths and limitations, or somebody who truly thinks differently that can give you an alternative
And
perspective.
there's this idea of a sounding board that many of us in business also have, or should at least thinking about establishing. And what you're suggesting seems to imply that, well, it's good to have a sounding board on the one hand, but maybe you want to think about changing the people that are on this board. Is this true?
What I really think is that a lot of times we go to a sounding board for somebody who makes decisions in a way we admire, and without necessarily being cognizant of it, we might turn to somebody who makes decisions like we do. Well, that's a bit of an echo chamber, right? They may also be a detective. And two detectives together just means we can further anchor on the data. It doesn't mean that we're expanding our understanding of the problem. So you do want to be thinking about who can bring a different perspective. And in those moments where you can't identify those different decision making profiles, you can ask yourself questions from each of the lenses of the problem solver profiles. So by just building your awareness of these different decision making types, you can also be checking and challenging your path forward.
And when you look at how your own thinking about decision making has changed over the years, what did you believe, let's say 10 or 15 years ago, that your experience in the meantime has most substantially revised?
I think this idea that cognitive biases are powerful is much more problematic than I initially thought. I thought, by recognizing that these biases exist and by trying to identify which ones for myself are the trickiest, that I would have an easier time circumnavigating around them. That's not true, especially when I'm moving quickly. I can make the same mistakes over and over. That's not something I want to do. I want to make new mistakes because I'm growing and changing as an individual. So I think that that's really big. And I think the other thing is that as we get into our adult life and it becomes so busy. You've got your work, you have your family, you have your charity activities and your community. It becomes tougher to just be out in the world and constantly meeting people who are totally different from that circle. And I think that's one of the great things about travel or museums or the subway, like these places where we run into people that we don't normally experience is so refreshing. And it really reminds us that there are perspectives outside of the groups that we normally interact with. And we can't get along better with other people unless we can actually make sure that we put ourselves into those environments and then we make sure to have those experiences.
And let's perhaps start slowly wrapping up our conversation today. And I would like to ask you, outside of your professional domain, what is it that you're genuinely curious at the moment that has nothing to do with your work?
I am curious about so many things. I have a list of things I want to spend time on. I want to take up the piano again. I want to take sketching lessons. I want to have an opportunity to see this new exhibit at the Frick Museum. I have so many different things that I want to do.
And is there someone or something in particular that is inspiring you right now, like a leader, a book, an idea, or something else that's motivating you?
I ended up having the great good fortune to meet this unbelievable inventor whose name is Marion Croak.
Mhm.
She actually wrote the foreword to my book, The Human Edge, that's coming out next month on AI. And I really see her as such a role model for how somebody can be in the world. She has over 200 patents to her name
Mhm.
and is one of the inventors behind Voice over Internet Protocol. And she's in the National Inventors Hall of Fame. And when you hear her talk about curiosity, she really makes it about coming into every day and bringing the question why. Why is it this way? Why does the light switch move up and down? Why doesn't it work some other way? Or why is it that anything happens the way that it does? And this simple question is so foundational, right? Something that is basic is something at the crux of how we can bring a lens to the world to help us to just see it much more expansively and to notice what's going on and to think about how could it be different and what does that say about us and possibility in a beautiful way.
What's her name again?
Marion Croak, Croak. If you listen to one of her talks that's online, she has an absolutely beautiful talk for the National Inventors Hall of Fame, where children have phoned in from all over the world to listen and to ask her questions about how to develop a curious mind. It will make you smile and it will make you want to be a better person.
I'll be sure to check it out. And if our audience members remember just one thing from our conversation, one insight, one way of thinking differently, or one action that they should take, what would you want that to be?
Well, I would say as artificial intelligence rolls out and as we're all starting to use this tool, you've got to remember that you're the chief decider in your own life, right? AI is going to make all sorts of recommendations, but it doesn't care about consequences. So as you're thinking about this as something that's going to be as part of your workflow and as part of your workforce, just remember that you need to remain the chief decider in your own life.
Cheryl, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you so much.